Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of America at 250, the podcast. Here I am with my colleagues, Beverly Gage and David Blight. And this week, you, in a way, it felt as though you got us in at least a familiar landscape with the present. You talked on Tuesday, the lecture was titled Race, Rights, and Resistance. And then today's lecture was Reagan's America. So we got the left and we got the right. In ways that maybe people watching will be familiar with or not familiar with. So I guess maybe actually my first question for you is, what did it feel like being in this moment, immersing yourself in those two ways of looking at the past?
Well, it is funny to be doing it with this particular class where we have such a generational divide in who's in the room. Mm-hmm. And so my sense, and those of you out there who are listening can tell me if this is right or not, that for the community members, who many of whom have living memories and kind of coming of age memories of these periods of the 60s and 70s, there was one experience going on. And then for the undergraduates, I think we've reached the period where they often don't get to in their history classes.
True.
And so, the 70s, 80s, 90s, especially in my experience teaching undergrads, is really a kind of mystery zone. And so I think they were having two radically different experiences of reaching what I think is starting, you're right, to feel like a familiar world. I mean, I think it's important about the 1960s, and this was the first thing that I said on Tuesday, when you say the 60s, it still is, kind of flower power, protest, rock and roll,
sex,
civil
drugs,
rights.
and rock and roll.
And I wanted to make the point early on that historians really now think about this thing called the divided 60s, which is a moment when whatever liberal consensus had existed in the 30s, 40s, 50s kind of comes flying apart under pressure from the left, under pressure from the right as well, which is the piece that often gets left out of the story of the 60s. And then, lots of people reconfigure their political identities and their political loyalties pretty quickly over the course of that decade.
And Bev, let's get you to talk a little bit more about these two huge phenomena that tore people apart in the 60s. One is the civil rights movement. Of course, it brought people together to some extent, but then it tore apart the country. And the Vietnam War. I mean, we had a foreign policy and a domestic question of the very nature of the United States that all came into collision in about a 5 to 10 year period, and we've never been the same since. How did those two huge phenomena come crashing into one another? I mean, and now we're talking about my lifetime, so...
Well, that's what I was going to say before.
Forgive the anecdotes.
No, this is today's episode was the first one that I was alive during, right?
Oh,
so
you guys are so young.
So I was having aha moments like everybody in the audience has been coming up to you and saying, I remember. So I did that too at the end of the lecture.
Right.
But David's question.
Yeah, well, the civil rights movement, I mean, it's interesting because it's very hard to say when this thing called the movement begins and ends. So historians tend to talk about the long civil rights movement, and even that people mean very different things. Does that mean it started in the 30s or the 20s or during Reconstruction?
Anti-lynching campaign.
Right. Or
1940, which is where you started.
There is this very intense period from about 1963 to 1968, when what you're talking about, David, these two forces collide. 1963 is the March on Washington, then the Civil Rights Act, then the Voting Rights Act, but then a surge of kind of experimentation, new organizations, militancy, conflict, fight, all around civil rights. And those are exactly the same years that Vietnam is escalating.
Right.
right? The United States really
65
gets
to 69.
in a significant way starting in late 1964. And then the peak of troop involvement there, which was, I believe, about 500,000 U.S. troops on the ground at its peak, is 1968-69. And so those two things converge. And I think what's particularly important about the 60s is that they are movements and transformative political experiences that are highly generational. So the people who are being asked to fight in Vietnam are mostly young people. And the people who are most deeply involved in civil rights organizing also by the mid-60s are mostly young people. And so I didn't talk about it much in lecture, but I do think there's a very distinctive generational story about these decades that you don't see really at any other moment in American history.
It's like a profoundly cultural moment, as in addition to being generational. And it's also, and this is probably not something that lots of people think about, but this is going to come to what you assigned for this week. It's also a moment when strategy and coming up with new and different ways to speak really powerful messages becomes important. So tell us a little about Bayard Rustin's Strategies for Freedom, The Changing Patterns of Black Protest. Why did you assign that, and what were you hoping for people to get from that?
Well, it's not a very well-known book, period. So everything else that we've been reading, at least in some moment in time, was quite well known.
It was a revelation in that
bestseller.
sense. I'd never read it.
No.
So this is Bayard Rustin, relatively late in his career in 1976, looking back on his experiences and trying to make sense of the long arc of the movement. And he himself had always been a sort of background strategist from the 1930s onward. There were a variety of reasons for that, as I suggested in lecture. One is that he was in the Young Communist League for a while in the 30s, and that in the midst of Red Scare, Cold War politics meant you had to be backstage if you were allowed anywhere near the stage at all. And then he was also a gay man, which also in the politics of the 40s and 50s meant that you probably were not going to be out front as your movement's spokesman. But what he's so good at doing is articulating and mapping out the varieties of strategies and the many experiments that were used to try to achieve civil rights over the time, right? The courts, political parties, all sorts of efforts at influence. And his argument is that what makes the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s really distinctive is the turn to nonviolent direct action as its core strategy. So it's a good book because it's short.
Well,
it covers a lot of ground.
Right? It was a lecture originally, right? Which is always
Series
a fine
of
reading
lectures,
experience. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, one thing there's a moment where he's surveying all the way back to World War I, and then he says, you know, the 1920s for Black people was one of the darkest times. That's, of course, contrary to the general conception of the 20s. Boom times, roaring 20s, prosperity. No, he said, dark times. And he said we had something called the Harlem Renaissance. He says, at least we could write about it. I mean, he has a wry wit.
He's funny.
But then he says the 30s were the hopeful time, and there, which is the Great Depression, but he's referring to unions, the New Deal, the Wagner Act, and so on. The government. The government now becomes a source of
organization
hope.
of various sorts.
Yes, all kinds of new organizations.
For purpose. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's not a book that will just sit easily with people's expectations.
I think that's one of the distinctive things about Rustin is that he comes out of this labor tradition. And that's really at the heart of how he thinks civil rights, but also economic security are going to be achieved is through this racially egalitarian forms of labor organizing as well as government action. And, you know, he's making an argument that actually wasn't very popular in 1976. So when he's doing this, he's been a little bit cast out of the movement, or people are describing him as a neoconservative. And that's partly because of a little bit of that social democratic tradition, but it's more because he is making an argument that, Black people in the United States are somewhere between 12 and 15% of the population, 11%, depending on your historical moment.
And the region,
but that requires is a kind of self-conscious coalitional politics as the way forward. It wasn't a super popular idea in certain circles, particularly in the early 1970s.
Right.
But he is a true believer in that. And he thinks that the labor movement and kind of organizing around economic issues is going to be the thing that's going to hold that coalition together.
And he never owned up to Black power. He was raised a Quaker. He's a serious pacifist. And he doesn't give any truck to you could call it the far left of the civil rights movement, although I'm not sure that's the right thing to call it. And therefore, he's still honoring the NAACP in the middle of the 1970s, which is not what most people were into. Black power had such a cultural impact.
Well, that gets us back to this question about the culture of this moment and the cultural clashes of the moment. Related to that, one of the things that struck me about it, and it wasn't a central point of the book, but it resonated so powerfully in a way because it wasn't really about strategy. It was about the foundation you have to have in place before you start strategizing. And he says at one point that you need two things to effectively bring people together in a movement, that people need to understand the history of where they came from, and they have to have a clear purpose. And that resonated so strongly, right? People need to know where they've been, people to understand where you are, and you have to have a vision of where you want to be, what you're looking for. It was, decades ago that he said this, but it speaks so strongly also to this moment, that there's a cultural, intellectual kind of a root that you need to understand who you are and where you are and what you want to work an effective strategy.
And he surveys for us as readers a whole array of leaders. And I'd ask you to talk a little bit more about A. Philip Randolph, because Randolph is clearly Ruskin's hero in a host of ways. Who's Randolph? And people don't tend to know him today. He's...
Right. A. Philip Randolph was one of the kind of great leaders of the long civil rights movement. And he's someone, he started out as a socialist in the World War I and early 20s period. And he retained a lot of those commitments for a long time. So I think for Rustin, A. Philip Randolph is really this model of the person who sees race and class tied in together and wants to organize.
Doesn't remain
in
static.
both.
He can change with time.
Right. And so
he's there from the beginning.
His big achievements really are the creation of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in the 1920s, the first kind of all-black and black-run union. These are Pullman porters, people who are working on the Pullman trains. And then in the 40s, in the very early 40s, in the run-up to World War II, he conceives of the first March on Washington, which ends up not happening because the Roosevelt administration gets very disturbed by this possibility. And so
but it was going to happen if
for sure. Yeah. And so he remains kind of one of the great old men of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s leading up to the 1963 March on Washington. And I guess one of the reasons that I think looking at that march through the lens of Bayard Rustin is important is because often when that comes up in our history classes or our popular culture, right? You get Martin Luther King saying, I have a dream. And the story basically is that King was such a powerful orator and his vision was so persuasive that Americans said, wow, we really have to, get a Civil Rights Act. And there's some truth to that. King is a very powerful orator and it's a very powerful vision. But it really obscures all of the work that went into creating a moment like that, the organizing on the ground, the strategy, the political maneuvering, the fact that, that march was a bunch of different things, but one was a direct ask to Congress about something very particular, the Civil Rights Act. And so I think we often leave out precisely what Rustin is good at, which is the strategy. And he was good at the big picture strategy, the grand strategy of organizing. But then he was also really good at just making sure the sandwiches were where they needed to be.
Right. We don't tend to appreciate those people, though, generally speaking. That goes all the way back. I could say the same thing in early America, that the people who are not the people coming up with a big message, or not the people thinking about the people, but who are organizing behind the scenes, doing the work that actually puts things into place, and nothing happens without them, and then we generally don't recognize them.
Right. In Rustin's book, before we leave him, also lays out probably the single greatest divisive element of the whole civil rights era is whether this should be a movement aimed at the United States government, the American conscience, or a separatist movement. And there were obviously separatist elements of the whole civil rights era. Rustin essentially, though greatly tested, so was King, is never going to give in to that. It goes back to your point about only being 11 or 12% of the population. But this is a story we have to keep alive throughout this course. When does great change in this country come? By pressing the government, forcing, if you can, not just at election time, the government to act, in other words, through law. And when does great change come outside the law? Mass protests, sometimes violent. And, of course, the civil rights movement is the prototypical question, the prototypical phenomenon through which we always ask that. And the fact that he has strategies in the title of the book, it's all about organization, strategy, and then action.
But that idea of pressing and where the pressing is coming from, right? That's the story of America. You go all the way back to the Revolution, and what you have are people who no longer feel that they can get the king to even read what they're saying, and so they find ways to make demands and speak out in a way that, for them is actually outside the system. All semester, we've been watching people sort of figure out how to make change really bottom up, even though it requires change at the top.
Well, and I do think there are certain, the circumstances change, the context changes, the issues change, but there are these sets of eternal questions. I think we talked about this with the abolitionists and with others, right? Are you a movement of reform, seeking to kind of save the system as it is, but improve it? Or are you a revolutionary movement that thinks it needs to be torn down? Questions about who's in your coalition, who's outside your coalition. Are you going to engage electoral politics? Is that a viable thing? Or do you need to find some other set of tools?
Exactly the story of the abolition movement.
Rustin is asking all these questions to almost anyone who gets involved in politics at any moment.
Could be a final exam question somewhere in there. I feel it coming.
David, you're giving it away.
Not quite.
But the fundamental question in a democratic mode of government is, how do you make change? Not hoping that your representatives are going to do something for you in Congress, but actually coming and speaking and strategizing in ways that are bringing what you want to the
I will
forefront.
also say in Bayard Rustin's case, I think he was deeply shaped by the internecine battles of the 1930s and early 40s. And the Communist Party had a really wacky vision of a kind of separate black nation being created in the United States. So those same questions were alive in the 1930s. I think that's the moment that really formed him. He had been in the party and then he left. And for Bayard Rustin, no one dislikes the communists like the socialists.
Right, exactly.
Exactly. This is also just a story of
just
factions.
Like in the early republic, when one learns about the early republic, you can't help wondering, how in the world did this republic even survive? I mean,
they thought that all the time.
Oh, I know, and the factions are so deep. The Hamiltonians hated the Jeffersonians, vice versa. We could go back to those examples. It's the same in the long civil rights movement, if that's what we want to call it. So many factions, so many different strategic groups, so many schisms. A major part of it rooted in the Black Southern Church, the Baptists especially. But then there are other radicals, basically educated and trained in northern universities, who don't come from that tradition. And the schisms were terrible by the mid-'60s and late 60s.
That's what I wanted to ask about. Was you talked today about the rise of the conservative movement. One of the points that you made was the different factions and ideas that were pulled together to sort of create a movement. You know, at one point in the lecture today, you said something like, I guess, was it the conservatives who believed that the parties were too similar?
Everybody, lots of people, the left and the right, believed that
the parties were too similar because
I grew up with that politics. It's like Tweedledee, Tweedledum. What's the difference?
But you know what I was thinking of, which of course I was, is that in my period when you're beginning to get partisan alliances, in many ways they were very similar. In many ways they agreed on a lot of things, and the part of the conventional wisdom when you're looking at that politics as a historian is that's why it was so fierce. Is because it was the intensity of small differences with big outcomes. So talk a little bit about the rise of the conservative movement and the bringing together of all of these factions.
Yeah, the conservative movement was very self-conscious, particularly through the figure of William F. Buckley and National Review, which gets its start in the mid-1950s, about needing to bring together different factions in order to have not only a kind of set of political alliances of convenience, but actually trying to make the ideas cohere. And the label that they put on that was fusionism. And fusionism in particular meant you're going to have to get your free market libertarians together with your traditionalist, religiously oriented conservatives, together with your anti-communists. And so they have some things in common. And anti-communism in some ways was supposed to be the glue that held this together because you could fight atheistic communism, right? That's a good appeal to your religious traditionalists. And you're fighting concentrated power and control over the economy, and that's your libertarians. But it's an interesting story because that set of alliances and kind of intellectual working throughs is quite self-conscious among a relatively small group of people. And then the political story, all sorts of things come along that they did not anticipate. And so the political coalition that kind of brings these ideas to power is very much a political coalition that comes out of the reaction against the civil rights movement, the reaction against the anti-war movement, and the very fast-changing politics of the 1960s. So when Richard Nixon gets elected or when Ronald Reagan gets elected, they don't have these blowout majorities because of the careful work of fusionism, right? There's a lot of other stuff going on. And yet the intellectual work that went on to create that vision is important to the ways that politics plays out.
There has to be an us. Well, this gets back to Rustin, right? There has to be an us with a vision or a goal or something. And it sounds like that's what you're saying this effectively.
You know, by the time of Reagan, it was, well, I should read more about Reagan and not just rely on memory. Very dangerous to rely on memory. But Reagan
Your memories are wrong, David.
What's that?
Your memories are wrong. I'm just going to go out
They're
on
wrong
a limb
every
and
time
say,
you use them. But Reagan ran against the 60s. And the conservative movement was a reaction to all the changes, including feminism and every movement you could think of. Nixon, a decade earlier, more than a decade earlier, is a reaction to the 60s. Talk a little bit more about Richard Nixon and that particular Republican Party. He's completely wrapped up in the Vietnam War, which is what killed LBJ's presidency. But the Nixon phenomenon, Nixon's kind of conservatism is different because he goes back to the New Deal. Well, so did Reagan in his lifetime.
Reagan just, he's quite old when he becomes president, which is one of the things that's appealing to me as a future Reagan biographer is that he has.
We're going to do this course again in 10 years
sweep.
after Bev finishes 8 years.
Let's do it.
But Nixon's kind of conservatism was reaction politics to a great degree. The student protest movements, Vietnam protest. But on the other hand, it was still an older kind of conservatism.
Right. I mean, Nixon's formative period is the 40s and 50s.
Yeah.
It is the Red Scare, and
Right.
he's a slightly more moderate version of Joe McCarthy and of a kind of anti-communist politics rooted in the Republican Party. But he was a hardcore anti-communist. He made his name on the House Un-American Activities Committee, and then he's Eisenhower's vice president during the 50s. Right. And so he was sort of the right anti-communist pit bull for Eisenhower, who wanted to have this much more kind of moderate self-presentation. But nonetheless, he was an Eisenhower Republican in some fundamental sense. And in the lecture, I showed a Nixon ad from 1960 when he was the Republican presidential candidate, and then one from 1968. And in their style and their message, they could hardly have been more different.
It's really effective to show one after the other like that.
Yeah. I mean, just the reaction against the politics of the 60s. But I think it is important to say that the conservative movement was not just a reactionary movement, which is to say, there's a form of backlash politics that's happening for sure during those years, but it's a combination of a vision that's laid down pretty early on, and then that is rapidly adapting to all of these new circumstances that are coming along in the 60s and 70s.
Isn't it interesting? You in your lecture, you used the word aspiration. And the 60s, of course, the 50s too, but the 60s is such an aspirational time. America rules the world, except with the struggle with the Soviet Union. And they're
important asterisk.
Very important. And the Cuban Missile Crisis almost blew up parts of the world. But it's such an aspirational time. America can do anything. And it landed on the moon, for God's sake. But the conservatives had aspirations.
Yeah,
and
what was
sometimes
their...
I think we on the left ignored that.
That was precisely what I wanted to get from you, is how you would sum up. You had the great passage. Was it from Buckley? Stop.
Yeah.
Right. They're just stop. There's too much. But how would you describe their vision, the conservative movement's vision of what it is they really wanted, other than stop?
Right. Well, I think there's stop and go back is actually something that
Preserve
in some ways
tradition.
is quite consistent, and that means different things, right? So that can mean precisely as you're saying, what is a conservative? It's someone who wants to conserve, right? So there's a go slow, don't make too many changes too fast, respect established institutions, respect the order as it exists. There is a version that's very particularly about the federal government and federal power. Yeah. Now, I think we've said at various moments in our discussions that are you a kind of pro-federal or are you a state and local person? Often it just has to do not with some abstract set of questions, but with what these different levels of government are doing. And that's true in this case. But there's a critique particularly of the New Deal, the concentrations of power, the interventions in the economy, the rise of an administrative state, right? Hayek's planners, that's one piece. And then as time goes on, Supreme Court decisions, Brown versus Board of Education, Roe versus Wade, the school prayer decisions, right? So that becomes a critique of a different kind of federal power. Affirmative action, right? There are all sorts of. 70s. So I'd say that's a key piece of this. And then, of course, there's a win the Cold War, right? It's centered around anti-communism writ large, but it's also a much more aggressive approach to Cold War strategy.
The Cold War sort of wrapped around almost everything in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I mean, the claim was always that foreign policy ended at the shoreline, or what's that phrase? Because both sides would agree. Not always.
It's really effective us versus them that has obviously real roots, but it's a...
And they had just as many nukes as we did by the mid-60s.
Right, the intensity of it. And in every way, right? Culturally, politically, economically, it was such a frame for understanding things. that had such a power to it, right? I mean, it's been looming throughout your lectures, the power of the Cold War.
Duck and cover. Duck and cover.
Did you have?
Yes, I had to do duck and cover.
We
under the desk. We had to get under the desk.
We had earthquake drills in California.
No,
that was a different reason to get under the desk.
For the record, I was born in the 70s, so it was a little...
Okay. Never had 60s, to do duck and cover. You never saw a fallout shelter.
Funny you should make this case about communism and anti-communism of the Cold War, because next semester I'm teaching a whole course that is premised on this idea that the politics of communism and anti-communism, and then particularly the Cold War, was sort of the structuring force of the 20th century that makes it a little distinctive from what came before, and then also from what is going to come after. That rupture of the late 80s, early 90s, when the Cold War comes to an end, really changes things in ways that I think we're just starting to experience and appreciate. And I will just leave that as a hint, because that's going to be my last lecture on Tuesday.
I was going to say, I know, and so now you've hinted at that. When we come to the end of our conversation, it's like, what comes next? But
can't we still ask just how much of a robust Cold Warrior Ronald Reagan was, and how much that was part of his whole shtick? Evil empire.
Well, one of the things that
and then he gets the credit for the end of the Cold War eventually.
Reagan, one of the other reasons that I'm interested in writing about him is coming from this premise that this is, the structuring force that makes the 20th century distinctive. Then Reagan is such an interesting figure, because I do think that it is... you can see in Reagan the intersections between domestic anti-communism, the kinds of policies that he's developing, and his Cold War status, right? His vision, what he loved to say about the Cold War is, I have a vision. We win, they lose. And that was his... I mean, he liked those sort of pithy things. And there's a debate, as we'll see, about whether the United States actually precipitated the end of the Cold War, or Ronald Reagan, or lots of other forces at work. But
it was defining, and Joanne, you were putting your finger on it. Again, not because I grew up then, but everybody was aware of nuclear weapons. Did we fully understand what they could do? No. Except from the films and
the doomsday clock.
Oh yeah,
that freaking doomsday clock
and doomsday movies.
Well, but the clock, I was obsessed with the clock, and something would happen, and it would move 1 minute closer to the end of time. And I was little, but I understood the meaning of that.
Well,
that was
cinema
scary.
loved that idea, and of course, there are many great Cold War movies. But you really were conscious that the two powers in the world now had the weapons to destroy everything. And if you really finally believed that, it tended to dominate your consciousness.
How could it, in a way, how could it?
Yeah. Well, people did all kinds of things to avoid it, just as we do today.
When you look at what something like the Port Huron Statement, which is the original statement of Students for a Democratic Society, it's supposed to be this generational cry.
Right.
And a lot of what they're saying is, how could you have made this world for us, right? How could you have made a world in which humanity is about to destroy itself? They say in that document, we live with the consciousness that we may be the last generation of human beings alive on this earth. So I think the current generation has a version of this in climate change, right? These kind of apocalyptic fears. Now that's going to be slower moving, and hopefully we'll come back from the brink. But I think it's a good analogy to that sense in the 60s. Like, you're telling me that you've created this amazing thing, and yet what it's produced is perpetual war, the potential destruction of all of humanity. And this isn't what we want. We want to make a different world.
The intensity of both of the things we've talked about, right? You mentioned, David, the sort of intensity of we rule the world, we're the best, that's pretty intense. And then equally intense is, it could be destroyed because, we're sort of out there, and there's the Soviet Union, and the intensity of the I guess, aspiration, to use the word that you used, and of the sense of looming possible disaster, that kind of gets at a lot of, I don't know, the 70s, would you say?
Well, I do think one of the big stories of if you start in 1960 and end in the mid to late 70s, one of the really dramatic things that happens and actually doesn't go back, even Ronald Reagan or Cold War triumphalism, is a sense of trust and faith in the fundamental institutions of the country, particularly large institutions, right? That takes blows in the 70s for all sorts of reasons, Watergate being one, but not for sure the only one. And then this story that we've had through most of the 20th century, starting in the progressive era, that with human will and ingenuity, the future can be better than the past.
And our technology.
Right. And technology. And that faith really starts to unravel in the 70s. It is difficult to hold on to. And now, actually, one of the, I think, most distinctive features of the 21st century in the United States is that many people say that they believe that the future is going to be worse than the past. And that's a radical shift in public consciousness, in relationship to technology or national identity. It's one of the, I think, saddest and most difficult challenges right now. And I think it happened in the 60s and 70s.
It did. It did, Bev. Again, I don't have any data at my hands right now, but something like the moon landing. I mean, it has to be. I mean, I watched it with my grandmother. So
I was woken up.
And she didn't believe it.
I was woken up in my pajamas with the little feet and stood in front of the television because this was a moment.
Are you all just going to chat about your...
No. It's terrible that
I know.
we do that.
I know.
But just, all right, let's just be historians again. You know, in some sense, all those young people, God bless them, who went to Port Huron, the SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, went up to Port Huron and created that famous statement. And I was a small part of that about 5 years later, 7 years later. But if they had been taking enough history, I mean, here we can be smug historians here for a moment. You know, they would have seen some of these continuities from 2 world wars, from the total redefinition of the geography of planet Earth, gigantic bipolar conflict between the Soviets and the United States. And then this weapon, our technology finally created the weapon that could destroy everything. Now AI could. I mean, that's not new. But, you know, God bless them. They were angry. They had all this middle-class aspirations, suburban kids. It's supposed to be, I'm going to college, I'm going to rule the world, I'm going to invent things, I'm going to create, I'm going to be a poet, I can be anything I want to. And women now can begin to think. That's going to take yet another decade. Young women can begin to think, I can do anything I want, anything. That's the 60s too. This incredible aspiration that anything is possible. And then you get a Cuban Missile Crisis, and you get one disaster after another. You get terrible riots in American cities, which astonished people because they never went to those cities. And suddenly by the 70s, there's...
people who are complaining about cities who've never been to them.
Well, no kidding. That's why they had suburbs. But no, I mean, but by the 70s, there's a turning inward. Like, oh my God, you know, just get yours if you can.
Well, I do want to say generationally that one of the points that I was making in lecture today is that it is not just young people of the left, many of whom were, in fact, children of 30s leftists, right? Red diaper babies, communists, children of communists. But it was also young people on the right who are organizing, who are asking a whole set of questions. And I think with our standard
Dick Cheney was a creature of the 60s, lest we forget.
Right. I mean, whole generations.
A whole bunch of them.
And, you know, Young Americans for Freedom was an incredibly important organization for channeling some of those youth energies into conservative politics generally, but particularly into Republican politics and into the transformation of the Republican Party. And I think it's easy when we talk about the 60s to see theatrical protests and say, oh, that's the story of the 60s, or even violence, right? Moments of conflict, uprising, all of that. But if you actually look at the electoral politics of the 60s and where it leads, certainly 60s, 70s, and 80s, it's a very, very different story coming out of that. And it's a little less flashy in certain ways, or it's a little bit less of the imagination. But it goes back to actually the same point that I was making about Bayard Rustin, which is there's a lot of organizing going on to produce these things that then suddenly seem to come out of nowhere. The victory of Richard Nixon or the victory of Ronald Reagan.
And let me ask, sort of related to that from a different angle. So on the one hand, you have all of this clashing and banging up against, of all kinds of people banging up against each other. On the other hand, you have these movements that you've been describing. One of the things that struck me about your lectures this week is that in a different way than we've talked about so far, obviously you talked about Black Americans in the Civil Rights Movement, you talked about Native Americans, you talked about women, you talked about a number of different groups in this period coming forward and in one way or another demanding rights or recognition or whatever. And it struck me, nowadays people like to lump things like that under identity politics. But what struck me was the many ways in which these many groups in that moment understood in some strategic ways, but also in aspirational ways, that this was a moment to try and have a voice. I ran up to you after class and became one of the people in the class who runs up to you and says, I was alive then. But, you put a picture up, a photo up of Jerry Falwell with a bunch of sort of happy singers behind him, 1980, Reagan running. And that, I was a college freshman, and I went to hear a Reagan speak at a rally, and there were Christian singers on the stage. And for the first time in my life, I thought, wait, religion? Like, they don't want me to vote for them? And I don't know if they really like me. Suddenly it was like this explosive brain moment where I suddenly understood that my identities, plural, had something to do not necessarily with the politics, but with the messages and the strategizing and the many ways in which they were trying to tell a story and create a vision.
Well, I will say in the 4 minutes of lecture where I said, and then there came all sorts of movements and started going, the American Indian movement, the Young Lords, the women's movement, the gay liberation movement, the environmental movement, the disabilities movement, all of those things. That I felt like I had reached sort of peak America at 250 absurdity.
You're making lists.
And
using the word and then.
I thought that it was good to do that.
Because, there is a generalization there, right? Which is
absolutely.
That rights movements come to style themselves and organize themselves quite differently in a political moment. Now, that seems very normalized to us today, such that it is hard to remember that it is something that was invented at a very particular moment in time. And in fact, the phrase that you used, identity politics, is something that's coined in the mid to late 70s in an attempt to describe why this is a useful way of organizing and participating.
So was political correctness born of that decade, but it meant something
very
really different than it has come to mean over time. The word woke wasn't around yet, but I think a point to stress, underline, is that for every person who went to a protest of some kind in the 1960s or early 70s, there was at least one other person who never got near it and hated it. And I think it took a lot of people of my generation quite a while to understand that. Didn't want to see that, didn't want to understand that. I don't think I understood it when I was a high school teacher. But it took Reagan's 2 elections, 2 successes, landslide in the second time, and then Bush #1 following him. We had 12 years of Reagan and Bush there. All of that was a reaction to this massive reform impulse of what we're calling the 60s, but it was...
Well, it's not all a reaction. But anyway.
No, it's not all reaction. You made that argument.
But
it comes from somewhere.
Yes, it does.
And it comes from a philosophical tradition.
Add more to that. Add more, because you're right. It's not all a reaction. So put in what is fostered.
Well, it's just the same point I was making before, that there is actually a lot of organizing going on. There is a vision. So it's
conservatives had their own 60s.
Right. When you say when people use the word reactive or reaction, it often implies that there's no that it's momentary, it's spontaneous, and sometimes it is, right? Events change as they go along. But I wanted to pick up at something that you were saying about the ways that Reagan's election and the politics of the 80s and 90s actually led lots of people to narrate the story of the United States in a different way. Right. And it had a dramatic impact on the historical profession, actually, and on American political history, because while there were lots of debates before that moment, the basic story from the Progressive Era to the New Deal to the Great Society was this story that was about liberal progress and expanding rights. And, it was never entirely true, but it was the narrative that historians were still at least wrestling with and attached to. And, one of the things my graduate advisor, a political historian named Alan Brinkley, in the mid-1990s wrote this sort of mea culpa or call to arms for the historical profession, saying, looks like we missed something. And he called for the study of conservatives and right-wing movements. And it led to this huge flourishing and outpouring of historical work around that.
You teach them.
I teach them. But many, many others do too. But it's also, I think, interesting to look at the ways not only that historians were forced to rethink certain fundamental assumptions, but that people are constantly revising what they think the story of the United States
based on what's happening
in adapting to new events and developments.
Another classic example is how the Vietnam War affected the way we studied the Civil War. For that matter, all the wars. But Vietnam had a profound impact on a generation of people coming of age, younger now, who wanted to study the American Civil War. The American Civil War got much darker, bloodier, so to speak. We started writing about the savagery of war. We started writing about the impact on common soldiers because we were surrounded by Vietnam veterans going through trauma and post-traumatic stress. There's no question about that link. A lot of people have written about that. If you look at a decade or two of scholarship about the Civil War, it's really changed by Vietnam. Yeah.
Now it's interesting.
I don't know about the revolution.
Well, that's what I was about to say. So, but you guys help me sort of fit this together, because in the semi-recent past now there's a bunch of scholarship that's on the revolution was violent, right? That the revolution was bloody. That the revolution, we're not going to talk glorious, propaganda. We're not going to talk about
liberties. Just a few outings to found a republic.
The United States was grounded on violence, and it's interesting.
And it was a civil war in the South, right? Didn't it?
Well, it was. Some people at the time called it a civil war, right?
Yeah.
But the idea that now, in the present and a little bit before this point, we're getting a bunch of scholarship saying that, probably also in the same way that the Vietnam War changed the way people think about the Civil War. In this moment, when we're really kind of examining some pretty big founding principles, generally speaking, it makes sense that people are not so happy to go into a perfect, idyllic, civic, calm founding.
And I do think maybe this would be a good place to end. There's this word presentism.
Oh, yeah. The
perils of presentism. And, we're constantly telling students of history not to be presentist. And what that generally means is don't see the world as it is today and then assume that the past is the same way. You have to set that aside and go into the past.
Try looking forward in time, not necessarily looking backward.
Right. But there's a good form of presentism, or at least an inevitable one, in which present events, the changing landscape around us, actually produce interesting new questions about the past.
Right.
They allow you to see things that you couldn't
Narratives.
see in the past, ask new questions, find new narratives. And that is a good form of
That's true.
presentism.
Well,
That
I
you have
think-
the distance to be able to see new things, but also I think along the lines of what you were just getting to, to see different narratives that might not have been so apparent without living through the moment that you're living through.
I love that we're going to end on this, but let's not quite end on it just yet because it's so important, especially as we get into essentially contemporary history. Because you can be presentist in a very effective way. That is, you really are aware of how you're making your assumptions, of how you've even chosen your subject, of how you're even considering sources in an archive. And God knows, we've discovered whole new archives because of the questions we're asking. On the other hand, you can be the kind of presentist who just says, I have an ideology. I'm going to find the history that fits my ideology, and I'm going to convince everybody that my ideology works,
That's
whether that's
bad
Marxism.
That is
that's
bad
presentism.
presentism.
It's also just bad history.
This is terrible
Yes.
history.
Yes,
It's
yes,
terrible
yes,
history.
yes.
And
Right.
it's what we're being accused, of course, these
Well,
days.
right. And that's, I always tell my students, if you if you want to see something in the past, you can find a way to find it. That's not
sure.
the way to look back. It's not, here's the point I want to make. Oh, look, I found 3 random quotes and I can find a way to say it.
The
But then
fun
you have
part-
to tell them, be ready, because the past will surprise you.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
The whole fun part, I think, of being a historian is being curious and being
absolutely.
able to leap
surprised.
into
Yes.
worlds that are different from your own. So if you're
Absolutely.
only looking for what you already know, then where is the fun in that?
That's called ideological history. We were all taught not to do that. And yet today we're defending ourselves against people who think that's all we do. It's interesting.
It's not what we do.
Interesting.
It's immersing yourself in this stuff and then
That's an
seeing new
idea we
things.
might take up in that last class. We're working on it, folks.
We're trying to figure out what's going to
working on
happen in
that.
that last class. You'll be surprised, one way or another. But I guess this about brings us to the,
I guess
the
it
end
does,
of our
doesn't
time.
it? That's too bad.
Thank you, folks, for beaming in with us again for the almost last episode of this podcast. I think the next one is going to be the last one, which will be
What a
your
raucous
last.
ride we've had. here.
We have. It's going to be
Amazing.
your last lecture, and then in one way or another, the 3 of us are going to come together and do something together in that last class about where we've been and where we are. That will be amazingly cohesive and brilliant, and we just don't know what it is yet.
We don't know what it is
But
yet.
at any rate, thank you, folks, for being here again, and we will see you in the next episode.